Welcome to Sports Cards once again. A few days ago, I was driving home listening to music, and I started thinking about this weird connection between music and sports cards that makes for a great analogy when thinking about vintage cards and modern cards. Modern cards are like the pop music of the modern sports card hobby. They're the cool new thing that brings something fresh and exciting, but at the same time, a lot of these fresh new things are really just a rehashing of some other recent fresh new thing, but rebranded just enough to make it seem like it actually is a fresh new thing. That's pretty much exactly what happens with modern pop music. A music corporation finds a certain kind of sound that's hot for the moment, so they load up with artists who can create this kind of sound until they've soaked up every possible penny. With modern sports cards, that sound is the modern approach to color parallels. It's the cool, hip new thing, and each year it's rehashed over and over, but with just enough change to make it seem cool and new once again. Pop music is to music as modern cards are to the sports card realm. And just like pop music, there will likely be a lot of what is going on right now in sports cards that will be forgotten about in the coming decades. Certain things will last through, or will cause some nostalgia in the future, but by and large, the majority of what is happening with sports cards right now will not matter much a generation later. Just the same could be said of modern pop music as well. There are some parts of it that will last through to the next phase of things, but most will just fade away into nothingness. So, as I was driving home, listening to music and sinking deeper into this analogy, I got to going back in time through other music trends, and I kept finding other cool things that made this analogy become more and more interesting. My mind next went to the 1990s, where in the sports card world, you have the emergence of inserts as the cool new thing. Right at around the same time in the world of music, you have the emergence of alternative rock and grunge. Alternative rock and grunge were not necessarily massively different from some of the rock and roll before it, but it was just different enough to stand out as something new and unique, kind of like sports card inserts. Inserts were sometimes just a bit different than a normal base card, but they did have just enough extra special sauce to make them stand out as new and unique. But then in the music world, as the big companies began to catch on to the trend of alternative rock music, the music scene became overly saturated with it, and you started to hear more and more bands that really had lost a lot of that uniqueness that had been part of the music when it first began to become popular. Inserts did the same thing in the sports card world. Sports card manufacturers saw the potential for huge financial growth, so they expanded it to the point where they oversaturated the market, and once they did that, inserts began to lose that luster they once had. Now, alternative rock music never truly disappeared, and neither did sports card inserts, but both became kind of background to other trends. In sports cards, inserts continued to exist, but no one really cared that much about them anymore, except for a select few exceptional ones. With alternative music, pretty much the same thing could be said. In the sports card world, as the big companies saw the inserts beginning to lose interest, they tried a handful of things to try to spark similar kinds of interest to emerge again. Some didn't really take, and others did take, and played a major influence on the sports card market into the next decades. The introduction of autograph cards and patch cards both emerged just towards the end of the insert craze time period. These were two things that they tried that stuck, and that remain important to the hobby today. In the world of music, as alternative music was starting to fade from interest, you also had a lot of efforts from the big companies to spark some other similar kind of trend, but nothing really caught in the same way. Certain elements of that alternative sound did stick through though, and you can still hear the influence of a lot of alternative music in other more modern rock sounds. Kind of a similar trajectory once again between music and sports cards. Okay, so let's go back in time even a little bit more, into the 1980s. Now, in the 70s in the world of music, you had a lot of different things going on, but the music world was a pretty segregated scene. You had the disco fans over here, you had the funk fans over here, you had the rock and roll fans over here, you had the folk fans over here. All were quite popular in their own spheres, but those spheres were really quite separate from each other. But then, from out a house party at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx, New York, emerges a new style of music that combines features from a lot of different kinds of music and blends them together into something entirely new that sparks off the beginning of something that would become one of the biggest cultural movements in modern US history, the emergence of hip-hop. Hip-hop's effect on music and culture at large, worldwide, from then forward is undeniable. The music of hip-hop created something that had an energy all its own, and that influenced a lot of the sounds that came later across all genres. In the world of basketball cards, when going back to our analogy, the parallel I see here is with the emergence of the 1984 draft class and the 1986 Fleer cards. Prior to the 1986 Fleer set, basketball cards, though they did exist, weren't just that important. The community of collectors was made up of just a few heads, and it was really just a niche hobby. But with the emergence of the 1986 Fleer set, something entirely new was beginning to come to life. Those card sets of the mid to late 1980s could be considered the golden age of modern-day sport card collecting. The cards of the 1986 Fleer set were the Grandmaster Flash, the Melly Mel, the Curtis Blows of the basketball card world. They were the ones who sparked off a whole new massive cultural movement. sports cards suddenly became mainstream, and the start of a whole new generation, a whole new culture of sports card collecting began. Just as hip-hop was emerging in the music world to spark off a whole new generation, a whole new culture of music. Now let's keep going back in time with this analogy. Let's consider classic rock. Led Zeppelin, Leonard Skinner, Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stones, among many others. For many of the card collectors who have been collecting since the 1970s or 1980s, these and others of this ilk are probably some of the names that still grace their speakers on a regular basis. For collectors who have been collecting for this long, cards from this era have a special significance, just like the music does. They both speak to a deep-seated nostalgia, a time before cards became big business, when the collector was an authentic collector, not just in it to strike it rich. And the music was authentic as well, not over-processed and seeped of its soul like so much modern music is. This was a time when cards were straightforward and classic, and the music was too. Collectors collected cards like they collected records. They collected it to have it. They collected it to keep it. Nowadays, people look back at these earlier eras of sports card collecting in the same way that many look back on this era of music. They look to the sports cards as what it was all about: the player, the card, and the collection. None of this messy, sparkly BS. And many look to the music the same way. None of this shallow, catchy, musically boring, copy and paste, repeated garbage of today. Only the raw, unprocessed sounds from when music was music. But also, much of this narrative in both sports cards and music is rooted in a nostalgia that is missing a lot of the reality. In both sports cards and in the music of the time, there was a lot of gimmicky corniness. But that's not the element that most choose to remember. It was there, but nostalgia hunters would never want that to define the era. So those elements fade into the forgotten past, and only the best of the time stays in the memory, and ends up sparking that nostalgia. I don't know, maybe I could keep bringing this analogy back further and further, find some connections with this or that musical movement, but I feel like I'd only be reaching at this point. These were all the areas that my mind got to in this analogy, so I think I've taken it as far as I can take it. It's fun stuff though. But for now, that's all I have for you in this video. Maybe someday I'll actually make a video that considers modern versus vintage from a perspective of an investor, but this here was just more for some fun and for the sake of sports card philosophizing. Check you next time. Peace.